Coming up, Leonard Peltier's story is one heard far and wide. We have a new look at his case and the calls for clemency to President Joe Biden. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start in Lincoln, Nebraska, where the city welcomed its original people last week. City officials declared September 21st as Otoe-Missouria Day. This, of course, comes as an 1833 treaty removed the tribe to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. ICT's Shirley Snavy has this report.
It's very significant and very spiritual, very sacred to us that we are welcomed here by the citizens of Lincoln, the mayor of Lincoln, that we're able to walk on these lands that once our ancestors walked on themselves.
Mayor Larry and Gaylor Baird signed the proclamation at the Center for Great Plains Studies. Its director, Margaret Jacobs, was instrumental in welcoming the tribe home. Jacobs and Oglala citizen Kevin Aberesk are producing a movie centering on land return.
We wanted to do something with the original peoples of this area, the Otoe-Missouria. So we started out as a project that was just about making media, podcast, films, but we've really wanted to expand into actual actions.
How do you invite a people who've had their connection to their ancestral homelands severed by all the traumas that our people have suffered all across this land? How do you find a way to start to reconnect them to the rivers and the hills and the streams and all these beautiful things that you were forced to leave behind so many years ago?
In Lincoln, Nebraska, Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
In Massachusetts, a panel is exploring changes to the state seal and motto that would remove controversial Indigenous imagery. Appearing on state flags, the seal features a depiction of a Native American male underneath a colonist's sword. Critics say those images are references to the harm tribes on the East Coast endured by English settlers. Mashpee Wampanoag chairman and commission co-chair Brian Whedon says many want to see a completely new design. Some ideas for replacement include symbols or elements from nature. At a meeting last week, the commission disclosed plans to ask the public for feedback with a survey and several different forums. Well, mark your calendars. Sanoa LaRock is on her way to the Miss USA stage. LaRock, who is Anishinaabe, was crowned Miss North Dakota USA earlier this year. Her efforts have earned her recognition from some notable names, including former First Lady Michelle Obama. She will participate in the Miss USA pageant in Reno, Nevada on Monday, October 3rd. The event will air live on the network FYI and the streaming service Hulu beginning at 7 p.m. Central Time. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Leonard Peltier turned 78 years old this month. His case is getting new attention while a petition for clemency from the White House works its way through the system. I'm joined now by ICT's Mark Trahant, who has been taking a deep dive into this story.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Leonard Peltier has become a story that reflects other stories. One narrative describes Peltier as America's longest political prisoner, serving more than 46 years in a federal maximum security prison. In that telling, Peltier has become a humanitarian and a 78-year-old Turtle Mountain elder who has been incarcerated for far too long. A contrary story sets Peltier as the lead character for the crimes committed by the American Indian movement during the Wounded Knee era, and he is described by sources as a remorseless murderer. Yet that last story, which is still promoted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation on its website, is not the reason why Peltier remains in prison today. Today, he's at the United States Penitentiary in Coleman in Central Florida on charges of aiding and abetting in the murder of federal officers. The government's principal murder case fell apart on appeal years ago, yet the length of Peltier's incarceration has lasted longer than most federal convictions. All of that sets the scene for a petition to the White House. It calls for clemency, not a pardon, so that Leonard Peltier can return to his family at the Turtle Mountain Band in North Dakota. I spoke to Kevin Sharp, Leonard Peltier's clemency attorney. He is working pro bono, and he brings to the case an extraordinary background as a former U.S. District Judge who gave up a lifetime appointment because of what he sees as structural injustice. Take a look.
And then when it comes to that, it turned out that and I became familiar with mandatory minimums, and I was forced to sentence this young man to life in prison. I stepped down from the bench partly because of that in order to deal with and talk about criminal justice issues. That led me to the Trump Oval Office and working with Kim Kardashian to help free this young man. His name was Chris Young, and Chris is free today. We actually were able to secure clemency for Chris. That became a big story, not because of me, but because of Kim Kardashian. And so when that hits the paper that President Trump is actually granting clemencies, and here is a lawyer who may be able to help, I received a package of material from, ultimately I learned through Connie Nelson, Willie Nelson's ex-wife. And I sat down with this package, and it was the trial transcripts from Leonard's trial. It was newspaper articles. It was court opinions, photographs, and I just start going through it, and I am sucked in. I didn't know Leonard's story. I had heard a little something about Wounded Knee, but I was 10 years old in 1973, living in Memphis, Tennessee, pretty far removed from what was happening there, and even more removed in 1975 at a shootout on Pine Ridge, so I knew nothing about it. And then started to read about Leonard's case. And that sucked me in. Having a background as a lawyer and a federal judge, and most of my practice when I was a lawyer was in federal court, it was easy for me to see what happened. The what? The misconduct by the prosecutors, by the investigators, the rulings by the court that would never stand today because the standard of review is different. All of that was easy for me. What then has sucked me in for years since I first opened that package is the why. And that's what, for all of the constitutional violations that I found, it's the why. Why were they there? What was going on? What led to this point? It was the context. That's what's sucked me into this and has aggravated me, has made me angry, made me sad, made me confused. What are we doing and why are we here? And that's why Leonard Peltier is so important. This isn't about people with guns on Pine Ridge, South Dakota on June 26, 1975. That's part of it. But the real story is why. And as one of the courts said, one of the court opinions, the United States government needs to take responsibility for what happened there that day. And that's why I'm here. I had said this before that, multiple times in my life I've taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. I was in the United States military, took that oath. When I became a lawyer, I took that oath. When I took the federal bench, I took that oath again. And it means something to me. And when I see what happened here and the constitutional violations and the whys, why did these people throw the Constitution to the side? That's what brought me here. So sorry for a long answer to your question, but it just kind of scratches the surface as to what's going on.
Well, and this gets into so many areas, because you think about the stories that have been told about Leonard Peltier, and some of it's mythology, some of it's justice. But what I was really struck with by reading your clemency petition is some of the really basic facts that really have not got into public discourse before, especially the information about the trial itself.
Well, right, and that was, I kind of sometimes take that for granted because that seems easy to me, but because I live it, and that's why it seems a little easier. But most of this is not questioned anymore. There aren't even two sides. We know that witnesses were intimidated. We know that witnesses were threatened. We know that affidavits, knowingly false affidavits, were submitted to the courts. We know that. We know that when the trial took place and the prosecutor said, we only have this one piece of evidence, this shell casing, this ties Leonard to this shooting. We know now that they knew that wasn't true. And we only learned later, years later, after his conviction, that there had been a ballistics test that showed it wasn't his weapon. They knew that. If that happened today, those are known as Brady violations. If that happened today, is a new trial. What happened then is they changed their theory. Oh, okay. Well, we had said that he shot these agents, but in truth, and this is the government talking, not me, in truth, they say, we don't know who killed the agents, but we know Leonard was there. Okay, congratulations. There were 40 other people there with weapons. There were lots of other people there that day. There were 150 agents there. One of them killed Joe Stuntz, 21-year-old native boy. We don't know who killed him. We know it was one of the agents, but they never went to figure it out. So those are the facts that we know. And if that case was tried today, there is no way it stands. We know, and I had never seen this in previous clemency petitions, we know one of the jurors was admitted bias against Native Americans. She said it. But we don't have to surmise it. They asked her and she said it. If that happened today, he gets a new trial. So it's those things that drive me crazy when I talk about, look, I believe in the Constitution. Those are all constitutional violations. We get a new trial. So, you know, those are the kind of facts that a lot of people don't know. And there's a lot of misinformation, you know, no, he shot these agents. Nobody says that except for those people who weren't there. The United States government doesn't say that anymore.
Well, and that's what's so extraordinary about this case is he's often charged, at least in the public arena, with things that aren't part of the criminal case.
No, that's right. You'll hear people talk about him as if he murdered someone. There is no proof of that. You know, and a lot of times the press will do this, and it's because you do have to look into it, but you'll get reporters saying convicted of murdering 2 FBI agents. No, he wasn't, because they had to drop that theory. Once it was discovered, they hid the ballistics evidence to show that they knew he didn't do it. They dropped that theory and had aiding and abetting. It means he was there. And that's why even James Reynolds, who was the U.S. attorney on the case, not the first one, the second one, but he came in after the 76 elections. He came in and took over this case during the post-trial motion period and all the appeals and the habeas appeals. And that's why today James Reynolds says we need to grant him clemency. We never could prove that Leonard Peltier committed a criminal offense that day. It's time for clemency. And that's why, when you read my clemency petition, I think one of the things that had been missing is context, is the whole why. What was happening out there? You know, why are boarding schools important to this story? Why is land back important to this story? Why are mineral rights important to this story? It gets kind of messy, and it's multi-layered, and that is confusing to people. They want the easy story, and it doesn't exist. But the narrative that is the truth is they don't know who killed the agents. They need to take responsibility. Context matters, and that truth has always been out there. But I think we haven't had an audience that was willing to listen to it, and the time is now. And I think you've got an American public. Native Americans have always known these stories and this context. The average American citizen has not. And I don't think it's their fault, because there was nowhere to learn it. You had to go looking for it. And there's enough going on in your lives that you're not going looking for that. That doesn't seem to affect you. But now we understand it does. I think Standing Rock was a big catalyst for that. That woke up average Americans to go, wait a minute. Let's talk about these treaties and who owns this land and how did they get this land? And then the boarding school issue comes up, and now we're shocked. And even I had this, I knew they existed, but I had in my mind this was some relic of the 1800s, not the 1950s or 1960s, 1980s in some cases. That context matters to all of this. That generational trauma matters to all of this. One of the things is I read the story, and you have to know a little bit. I don't want to get too deep into who the Goon Squad was and why there was this internal fight that was going on where the United States government took sides as part of COINTELPRO and providing ammunition and intelligence to this group. But one of the things that I learned later was that Dick Wilson, who was the leader of the Goon Squad and is roundly criticized appropriately, but he was also a victim of the boarding schools. And so Dennis Banks, Leonard Peltier, and Dick Wilson all went to the same boarding school, not at the same time. And they all came out of there with their own traumas, and they dealt with it in their own ways. And so, right, all of that then comes back to its context. Let's understand what was going there. Let's get the federal government to take responsibility for what they were doing, and let's end this chapter and move on and start healing. You cannot heal unless you talk about it, and you can't talk about it honestly unless you admit your shortcomings, unless you admit the things that you did that were wrong. And even for the FBI, that wasn't today's FBI, that was Hoover's FBI. Let's end that. If you want to separate yourself from J. Edgar Hoover, this remnant of the Leonard Peltier case still hangs out there. You cannot sever that until Leonard Peltier is free. And so Leonard is so much more important than just Leonard. This is a symbol for so many things that are wrong. And that's why I believe the government needs this. They need Leonard home. The FBI needs Leonard released just as much so that they can move on, so that we can all move and start talking about this and start healing.
Ruth Buffalo is a Democrat who represents Fargo in the North Dakota legislature. This month, she brought forth a resolution to the Democratic National Committee calling on President Joe Biden to grant clemency.
Play basketball together in the independent ball circuit, but so yeah, I was asked to sign on a petition at a booth that Jean Roach was manning or tabling, and so from there again I was asked a year ago, last October, to sign on to another petition asking for Leonard's release, and then from there just felt compelled to help from where I was at. And so being in this legislative role currently, I reached out to colleagues. And so at that time, I believe we had 21 Native American state legislators sign off on a letter to President Biden. And then about 2 months later, we had the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators also sign onto a resolution asking for Leonard's release. And then after Leonard contracted COVID in January, the National Caucus of Native American State Legislators also issued another statement calling for Leonard's release. And then from there, within the state of North Dakota, our Democratic Nonpartisan League, we had our state convention in March, and so we presented a resolution asking for Leonard's release. And so that call for Leonard's release is now a part of the North Dakota Democratic Nonpartisan League's platform, calling for Leonard's release. And then missed the deadline for the spring DNC meeting resolution submission. So we our goal was the summer DNC meeting, which happened just a few weeks ago.
There is another story that is intertwined with the Peltier story, and that is the murder of Anna Mae Aguash. Her family and others have reached the conclusion that Peltier should at least tell what he knows about that case. But his attorney, Kevin Sharp, and others say that this is not about Peltier directly. They say he is in prison for aiding and abetting, and the constitutional violations that cost him a fair trial. And that's what they see as the focus. A statement from the International Leonard Peltier Defense Committee says there has been, quote, an extraordinary volume of misinformation spread about this case, and if there's evidence that has never before been produced, then we, quote, we encourage its unveiling if the true motive is justice. And that does not mean keeping Peltier in jail, the statement said.
To me, after witnessing what happened in North Dakota during the No DAPL movement, I was doing a part-time contract with the ACLU of North Dakota, and so I was on the ground from January, so to speak, from January to March to the eviction of the camps, and I saw firsthand the use of excessive force and the militarization of our law enforcement, and things that were mildly traumatic for me as an outsider looking in. Like, for example, pools of blood in white snow, and hearing like grown men say, "This is a war zone. This is a war zone." A delegation from the UN and also ACLU Human Rights Program out of New York City. They were really, so just being in that company and hearing other people share their expressions of disbelief and that couldn't believe this was happening on American soil and North Dakota, North Dakotan soil. It just really, it raised awareness to a larger issue of when people want to stand up for their rights, they are often scared into submission or forced into submission. And so I really think that Leonard is being made an example out of to keep people silent and to keep people from standing up for what is right.
Another element in this story is what Kevin Sharp calls an over sentence. No one in AIM has served in prison as long as Leonard Peltier for what happened at Wounded Knee or Pine Ridge.
Yes, I know there's so many people who have been praying since the 70s, for Leonard's release. And so we know that there's many grandmas and elder women at Turtle Mountain who pray for Leonard on a daily basis.
The legal process for clemency is now working its way through the government. Kevin Sharp explains.
Well, so we filed our clemency petition in 2021, in July of 2021. It's now been on file for a little over a year. This is about clemency. When I say that if his case was tried today, he would either be acquitted easily or at the very least get a new trial. But those appeals have already taken place, and because the laws that changed that made this such that he would get an acquittal today were not retroactive, legally he is where he is. And so clemency, presidential clemency, is our only option. And I think President Biden has an insight into the importance of the Native American communities, into the context that we're talking about, and he's a lawyer who understands the Constitution and what it means. and what it has to mean if we're going to continue as a nation. It cannot just apply to some and not to others. It was one of the things that the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, who did a multi-month investigation into Leonard's incarceration, not his trial, found, and the working group is made up of legal experts in human rights law, in criminal law, in international law, and what they found as part of their investigation is an anti-Native American bias within the parole system.
One last point. Leonard Peltier is not seeking a pardon. A pardon would wipe the slate clean. Clemency is the government saying enough, and it's time for Peltier to go home to his family. The petition to the White House says it this way: a grant of clemency will show mercy and compassion to Leonard, who has spent more years incarcerated than free, who has made substantial contributions to his community during that time, and is dangerously close to dying in prison.
Mark, thank you so much for that special report. And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.